Last month, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu provoked massive protests when he tried to force through a controversial judicial reform that would have given his government a veto over Supreme Court rulings and near total control over judicial appointments. Netanyahu eventually withdrew the reforms, but while this might have temporarily stemmed the protests, Israel's political crisis shows no sign of abating. The government's actions have strained relations between both Israelis and Palestinians, and between Israel and its Arab neighbours. And Netanyahu has made it clear that he plans on reintroducing the judicial reform when the Knesset returns from recess later this month. So in this video, we're going to have a look at what's happened, how Netanyahu has survived so far, and why Israel's political crisis is probably going to get worse before it gets better. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a quick recap of what's happened so far. Now, before we get into this, we should say we've actually done a series of videos on Israel's ongoing political crisis in the past. So if you want more detail, you can watch those. But the TLDR is that since 2019, Israel has struggled to form a stable government because most mainstream parties have refused to work with Benjamin Netanyahu, who's currently on trial for charges of corruption and bribery. Despite his legal troubles, a plurality of between 25 and 30% of Israelis still supported Netanyahu's Likud party, and this made forming a coalition without them very difficult. Israel suffered through 4 elections in 2 years trying to sort this out, until the opposition parties finally agreed to a diverse coalition government composed of 8 parties, including the right-wing Israeli Nationalist Party Yamina and Arab Islamic Party Ram. In normal times, these guys wouldn't be mates, but they were so fed up with Netanyahu and the preceding political chaos that they agreed to suck it up despite their ideological diversity. Inevitably, however, the coalition eventually collapsed, leading to more elections at the end of last year. Again, Likud won about 25% of the vote, but this time Netanyahu decided to form a government by allying with a whole load of right-wing Israeli nationalist parties. In the past, Netanyahu has avoided forming coalitions with the far right, but he apparently realised that this was his only way back to power, so that's what he did. The elections happened in November, and after about 2 months of negotiations, in late December, Netanyahu announced his cabinet, which included some pretty extreme ministers and some equally extreme policies. The most controversial of these policies was a judicial reform, which would essentially give the government, assuming it had a functioning majority, complete control over Israel's judiciary. While Israel does have a more activist judiciary than other countries, and codifying the precise relationship between the Knesset and Israel's Supreme Court is generally a good idea, Netanyahu's reforms would give him autocrat-esque levels of power and protect him from legal troubles. Israelis weren't too keen on this, which is why massive protests broke out across the country when Netanyahu introduced the bill to the Knesset in March. At the time, it wasn't clear how Netanyahu was going to survive the crisis. The Israeli public and certain members of the coalition, including ministers from Netanyahu's own Likud party, were demanding he at least postpone the reforms, while other ministers on the right of his coalition, specifically Itamar Ben-Gvir, were threatening to bring down the government if he backtracked on them. Essentially, different sides of his coalition were demanding contradictory things, and because he only has a slim majority, losing either of them would bring down the government, possibly triggering new elections, which polling suggests he would lose. Netanyahu eventually agreed to postpone the reforms, but to keep Ben-Gvir happy, he agreed to basically give him his own private militia. Technically, the new force is a National Guard, designed for, quote, national emergency situations, which the government claims will take some pressure off Israel's overstretched police force. However, Israel's police commissioner has already dismissed the force as nothing but a waste of resources, and opposition leader and former Prime Minister Yair Lapid described it as a private army of thugs for Ben-Gvir. While this temporarily calmed the anti-government protests, there was then a spike in tension between the Israelis and Palestinians. 2023 has already been one of the most violent years in Israel's recent history. 94 Palestinians and 16 Israelis have died so far. But relations got even worse after Israeli security forces raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque at the beginning of April. For context, the mosque is a holy site for both Muslims and Jews, who refer to it as Temple Mount. But since Israel occupied East Jerusalem in the 60s, there's been an understanding that only Muslims are permitted to pray at the site. Tensions over the mosque have risen in recent years, as growing numbers of ultra-nationalist Jews have tried to pray at the site, and Israeli security forces have become more muscular in their guarding of the compound. Tensions between these Israeli security forces and Palestinian Muslims boiled over earlier this month, and the videos of the Israeli Guards' response were pretty horrifying. In reaction, Palestinian militant groups in the Gaza Strip, southern Lebanon and Syria launched their largest missile attacks against Israel since 2006, which provoked retaliatory strikes from Israel. Hours later, 2 Israelis were killed by gunmen in an illegal Jewish settlement in the West Bank, and an Italian tourist was killed when a Palestinian drove a car into a cycle path in Tel Aviv. Netanyahu blamed the spike in violence on the opposition, who he claims encouraged protesters, while the opposition blamed it on Netanyahu and his controversial cabinet and agenda. To be fair, the opposition have a point here. Even if the judicial reforms aren't the direct cause of the recent spike in violence, it's clear that Netanyahu's government, especially his more right-wing ministers and their policies, have had a destabilising effect on Israel's politics. So what happens next? Well, things are probably going to get worse before they get better. It looks like Netanyahu is still going to try and force the reforms through when the Knesset returns later this month, which will probably restart the protests. In late March, he vowed that the reforms will pass one way or another, and last week he dismissed efforts by Israel's president to water down the reforms. On top of this, there are reasons to think that relations between Israelis and Palestinians are only going to get worse while Netanyahu is in power. The last few weeks have made it clear that he can't control his right-wing ministers like Ben-Gvir, and his waning popularity is only going to weaken him further. This will give more power to Ben-Gvir and co., which will probably mean more controversial policies and stunts. Ultimately, it looks like Israel's long-running political crisis is unlikely to resolve anytime soon. That's all for this video, but there's a whole world of TLDR content out there. You might not know, but we actually have 5 different TLDR channels explaining news from the UK, Europe and the rest of the world, breaking down the latest developments in the business world and also running through the day's most important news that you might have missed. TLDR has been doing this for around 6 years now, so to celebrate our anniversary, we'd love it if you subscribed. Not only to this channel, but also any of the others that interest you. They're all linked in the description. Our whole purpose is to make the world around you more understandable, to unpack the confusing parts of the news in a way that's interesting, factual, and entirely non-partisan. So if that's something you're into, then you have 5 channels to enjoy. Thanks for your support over the last 6 years. It really means a lot.